Taking diplomacy very seriously, French diplomat François de Collier admonished his prince to select ambassadors, quote, with a spirit fertile in expedience and quick penetration to be able to discover the secrets of men's hearts. With a dimmer view of diplomacy, Napoleon called his own chief diplomat, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, quote, nothing but a shit in silk stockings, close quote. What is diplomacy and does it work? Wess Mitchell, on his new book, Great Power Diplomacy, The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger, an outstanding exploration of the nature and efficacy of diplomacy now. My name is Tod Worner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Wess Mitchell is a principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, a think tank dedicated to the study of great power competition. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs under the first Trump administration. In that role, he was responsible for U.S. diplomatic relations with the 50 countries of Europe and Eurasia. He is the author of 4 books, including most recently, The Grand Strategy of the Habsburg Empire and Great Power Diplomacy, The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger. Wes, welcome.
Tod, thank you for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Segment 1. What is diplomacy? In Great Power Diplomacy, Wess Mitchell writes, quote, diplomacy has from its beginning been an integral part of conflict and therefore a strategy. At its highest ends, strategy is, quote, the calculated matching of means to large ends, close quote. Danger arises for a state when a gap between the means at its disposal in the form of military and economic power and the ends to which it could apply those things in the form of threats in the outside environment widen to a point that endangers the state. In effect, Mitchell continues, diplomacy's role in strategy is to help bridge those gaps. It is a political tool that states use to enhance the means at their disposal externally or reduce the number of threats arrayed against them, or both. So, Wes, as we talked offline, but I want to say this again, your book, which tells the stories of diplomacy in brilliant historical color, is simply terrific. So let's begin with the gaps between means and ends. Are the geopolitical gaps, that is the inequalities, the power differentials, the disparities between nations, states, and peoples, and then the competition that ensues, are those gaps the whole reason why diplomacy exists?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start in thinking about diplomacy. It's a good way to conceptualize it, and I appreciate the description, the glowing praise for the book. It's greatly appreciated. I mean, look, I think danger for any state comes when the means at its disposal, so think of military power, economic power, are insufficient for the tasks that it could reasonably set those tools to. So if you think of means for a state, again, as military or economic power, now think about the ends to which the state could apply those means. And that's usually in the form of threats in the outside environment. So you face opponents who are too numerous, or maybe they're too technologically advanced for your army and navy to just defeat them outright. That's usually the starting point. That's actually the emergence of that problem over and over again in history is what leads great powers, often against their first inclination, against their first choice, to look for some other means of either, you either are trying to delay a war, you're trying to keep from fighting 2 or 3 different opponents simultaneously because you don't have the muscle to deal with all of them. So really diplomacy comes into view in the human story all the way back to antiquity in the Bible and Thucydides. It arises as a necessity that states need to practice and to practice to a high degree of skill, not because they love peace or they want nirvana and harmony, which is, I think, how diplomacy is thought of nowadays, but as a hard-nosed tool of strategy that you better be darn good at it if you want to survive as a independent polity in a jungle-like setting where the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. You've got to have that ability. It's not every problem you come up against is necessarily solvable by the military or economic means at your disposal. So that's where diplomacy enters into the picture.
This book, as you're gonna find, or many people are gonna find as they listen, it covers this wide expanse of history, as in the title, from Attila the Hun to Kissinger, and example after example of these gaps and the means by which diplomacy seeks to deftly fill those gaps, or to bridge those gaps, if you will, beyond just military engagements and so on. So very early in the book, and so by the way, you're going to walk away from reading after reading this book, and you're walk away much smarter, because it's just a very vivid unfolding of living history, and it's extraordinary that way. So early in the book, you cite Archidamus's address to the Spartan assembly in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and you describe 4 fundamental ways that diplomacy can aid a nation. So you say, first, diplomacy can curb one's emotions. Second, diplomacy can gain control of the clock. Third, diplomacy can constrain the enemy. And fourth, diplomacy can attempt to put limits on war itself. So I'm going to have you explore those in a minute. But first of all, Archidamus presents himself at the very beginning. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Archidamus. He presents himself at the beginning of the book. You present him, but also he returns kind of at the very end. Because he's a pivotal, a kind of emblematic figure for some of the points you're making here. Who was he? And just explain a little bit about his importance at starting this book off. And then could you elaborate a little bit on those 4 primary uses of diplomacy?
Yeah, sure. So Archidamus is a very compelling figure that you see in Thucydides, who's, of course, writing about the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens in the 400s BC. And the Spartans, we think of the Spartans appropriately as a military people, kind of the Prussia of ancient Greece. Right. So there's this chapter early on in Thucydides where it's clear that Sparta and Athens are about to go to war. Athens has made a series of aggressive moves. Sparta's allies are sending emissaries to the Spartan capital and begging the Spartans to do something about this. That they're appealing to their sense of honor, to the treaties they have with allies. And the Spartans are pretty hot-headed. There's a lot of young guys in the room that have never been tested in battle. They've heard all of these stories from their dads or granddads from the Persian Wars. So the mood in the room is, let's this will be over by Christmas. Thinking that we've had in modern era, and this aging king Archidamus II stands up, and he makes a very calm and level-headed plea to his countrymen to stop and think for a moment. Mm. And his counsel to them is a counsel of prudence. And it is, we're probably about to be at war. It's going to be a lot worse than you think it's going to be. It's going to eat up our granaries and kill our people and probably last a very long time. Are we ready for that? Are our armories replenished? Are our granaries full? What's the state of our allies? Could we put a force in the field tomorrow? By the way, he says to them, the Athenians have a lot on their side of the ledger. Probably have more allies than we do. They certainly have more ships. So what's the ledger here? Could we have more allies than we currently do? Possibly even including the Persians. This thought is anathema to Greeks of that time, because until recently, the Greeks, of course, had been at war with the Persians. They were the main external threat. But it's a counsel of prudence and stock taking. And of course, he's answered by one of the hawks in Sparta, one of the leading hawks, the ephor, Sthenelatus, stands up and basically says, this is weakness. This is a counsel of weakness. And we're Spartans and we're men, and let's rush into this. And so it's interesting the way that Thucydides tells the story. It seems like Sthenelatus, the hawk, has won the discussion. And they vote for war, but it quickly becomes apparent that they're not ready for war. So Spartan policy actually ends up embracing Archidamus's counsel. And it's basically that we should get our affairs in order, send out envoys to allies, start getting ourselves ready. During that time, let's also send envoys to the Athenians. We'll remonstrate with them for peace. Who knows? Maybe they'll listen to us and it'll avoid war. But if they don't listen to us and we're at war a year from now, we will be better off in that war for having taken stock and prepared than if we had rushed right into it. So that's the starting point. And, in every chapter of this book, every episode of history that I looked at, It took no effort at all in the councils of these great powers across the ages to find a Sthenolatus and to find an Archidamus. The Sthenolatuses are way more common. It's every kingdom, every empire. When a problem arises, there is a man's man who stands up and says, "Let's go for the cold steel." And often they're the most appealing figures, and you can relate to them emotionally because they want to protect not only the polity, the republic or the kingdom, the empire, but they also want to preserve honor. And the diplomats usually come forward a lot like Archidamus as, at first kind of a quiet council. It's when it becomes clear, like in the case of the Spartans, that you really aren't ready for the war that you're about to be in, that suddenly the diplomats' counsel sounds like something other than temerity and weakness. Sounds like good sense. So that's the thread that runs throughout the book. Every chapter, I try to identify that starting point where there's a debate. The hawks are pushing for war. There's a voice of reason. It's not to say that diplomacy always succeeds. It often fails, and I looked at some failures. But that's the golden thread. The second part of your question about the uses of diplomacy or these recurring themes, what I would underscore in all four of the things you just mentioned is the notion of limits or constraints. The case that I'm making for diplomacy is the classical, the timeless case for diplomacy in Western civilization as a source of constraints on, yes, your own emotions. Primarily, it's constraints on an opponent. You're looking for advantage in strategy. You want more allies on your side of the table. But it's not the idea of diplomacy as an aggregator of power. So, Hitler and Stalin both had diplomats, professional diplomats, but they weren't conducting diplomacy any more than Genghis Khan was. It was the political arm of a policy of conquest. But classical diplomacy in the Western tradition is an inherently conservative enterprise that looks to put constraints on the accumulation of power, and then, as you said, also to constrain war itself. As Clausewitz described war as this primordial force that once it's unleashed, it's very hard to retain control of war. So diplomacy is a vital discipline for states to be able to set limits and constraints on war itself, to constrain an opponent. And that's I think that's another golden thread that kind of runs throughout the text.
We're going to have an entire section on diplomacy and human nature at the very end here, segment on that. What I love about what you're saying is the notion of prudence. I mean, we understand that we all know the notion of the hot-headed, young, emotional, let's go get them, let's pull the blades out and let's go to war and so on. And then everything kind of gets mired down and the theories break down and the realities are horrific, which doesn't mean that you don't have to go to war at certain times, especially in the Catholic tradition of just war and things of that nature. But that notion of prudence, I want to lean into a little bit of my field in the field of medicine. The Hippocratic Oath was always a little bit jarring to me. I mean, it's the right oath, but the notion of first do no harm. Why isn't it first cure illness? Why isn't first, change the world, first this, first that? And it's because there's a recognition of the limits of human fallibility, limits that come with human fallibility. And it seems what you're saying is Archidamus kind of speaks up to that and says from experience, from common sense, from intuition, from just knowledge of time and wizened years to say this always starts off seemingly ready to go well, but the devil's in the details and the devil's always going to be there. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's right. There are plenty of statues to great warriors all across the Western world, even unsuccessful warriors or generals. But how many statues have you seen in the great capitals of Europe or in the United States, or even the United States, of a great diplomat? Yeah. There aren't many. And I think that's partly because one of the main byproducts of diplomacy is compromise. So diplomacy proceeds from a tragic, and I think, Christian anthropology, the notion that we're fallen. It's the idea that the world is not going to produce a utopia. We have to live in it as it is and carve out the pockets of order that we're able to carve out for the specific political community that we represent. So nowadays it would be a nation state. But it involves compromise. And this would actually probably be a good moment for me to say, in short, what I mean by diplomacy at the top, since this segment is on kind of the definition of diplomacy. Diplomacy in the most general sense is simply communication between states. I mean, diplomacy exists on all kinds of things, fisheries, whatever. But I think diplomacy, as I'm writing about it here, what you might call high diplomacy, is the use of negotiations to advance the national interest in matters of war and peace, life and death. And I think diplomacy is best judged, like any art form, it's judged by its outcomes rather than its processes. And the chief outcome of diplomacy, classically understood, is the constraint of power, the constraint of passion, man, war. And so, yes, and we'll get to this later, I think, therefore, the best way to understand diplomacy is through history, which is a recounting of human deeds, as constrained by geography and other factors. But it's not by theory. Theory is boring. And so the book tries to come at this task, this enterprise that is diplomacy, through the medium of different vignettes across history, specific groups of leaders, how they wrestled with strategic problems that they couldn't just solve with military power, and then the glories and pitfalls of diplomacy. But it really is, the purpose of the book was to put diplomacy in its proper place, almost to rescue diplomacy. As a kid growing up, I loved military history. It's full of great stories and memorable events. I think we've lost a sense of what was great about diplomacy, some of its great accomplishments. And so in part, the book exists to tell that story and set the mind on diplomacy as it's classically been understood, rather than the modern conception of diplomacy, which very often is this idea of diplomacy is the negation of conflict. It's multilateral, multinational bodies that are adjudicating disagreements over war or climate change. It's John Kerry landing at Davos to give a speech lecturing people about climate change or whatever. But there's this modern notion since the end of the Cold War that we can escape conflict, that we can transcend it, and that the diplomat exists to eventually make the nation state go extinct, and we'll kind of find our way to Immanuel Kant's idea of a global federation or nirvana. And my book is therefore retrograde. It's looking back at the older classical understanding of diplomacy, which I think is something very different from what the word means to a lot of people now.
It is interesting because you do make that impression throughout the book so well, and almost to say a little bit of the people that consider this modern version of diplomacy to be diplomacy. You're saying, let me show you the examples of what true diplomacy looks like throughout history. And by the way, like you said, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it is forever consequential. And all these chapters you have, it's amazing the chess game that is being played, the calculations that are coming forth, the steps this way, the feints that way, the capitulation here, the win there, whatever. It's a brilliant. This is where I look and say, AI cannot replace this. This is the genius of what it means to be human, reading the room, if you will, and reading the circumstance. And again, we're going to talk about that in segment 3 a little bit. I want to say, Wes, so while diplomatic engagement and military force are two arrows in the state's quiver, they are frequently at odds with one another. And everybody kind of understands this. And you mentioned it yourself when you talk about hawks and doves. Diplomats often perceive the military brass as brutish, impulsive, and impervious to counsel. The military brass frequently considered the diplomats to be sniveling, weak, ineffective. And again, the battle's been characterized as being one waged between hawks and doves. Why is there such conflict between factions who should be more synergistic in meeting the state's vital ends? Is it just a matter of fiefdoms and silos and egos, or is it grander than that?
Well, I think I would reframe it slightly and say the tension is not so much as being between hawks and doves as it is between competing recourses for a state that is faced with a great danger. And one of those recourses, I think, is embodied by the hawks, who say, in every age, the state is facing a great danger. We have the solution for it. the appeal of the military um, option is efficiency, right? The idea that you can use the technology of your time to eradicate a problem that's almost never lives up to the promise.
Yeah.
But it's also this sense of the state's honor is at stake, and you will besmirch that honor by treating with an opponent that doesn't share your fill in the blank religion, your regime type, your whatever interests you're trying to pursue. I think the countervailing option that the diplomat represents, the diplomat properly understood, is not dove in the sense that that term is used today, of someone who's basically pleading for peace as the chief outcome.
Right.
I think historically, the diplomat's role, like Archidamus, has been a nuanced one. It's been a council of prudence that says, yes, we may very well soon be at war, and war may even be inevitable. But diplomacy is a tool that helps the state prepare for war, so by time, be more successful in war, so have more allies on your side that are aggregating greater power for yourself against an opponent, and ultimately assisting the state in the manipulation of time as an element of strategy. And so the case that I make in the book, I try to be as precise as possible in saying, what is this role of diplomacy and strategy? What's clear to me from all of these examples is that diplomacy's role in strategy is about rearranging power in space and time, so that you can avoid a test of strength that's beyond your ability to bear at a given moment. And the short word for that is concentration. So if you face three opponents, like think of U.S. today, Russia, China, Iran, if you face multiple opponents and you don't have a military that's set up to defeat all of them at once, you're using diplomacy to either turn off or lower tensions or find détente in at least two of those theaters, to concentrate scarce military power on the third theater. You're mobilizing alliances in all of these regions, but especially in those regions where you won't be able to put a preponderance of force immediately. So I think it properly understood, diplomacy and force. It is a truism, but it is also nevertheless true that diplomacy and force are codependent. And the further detached you get, the further you detach these from one another, the more likely you are to pursue a path in which the state will ultimately fail.
So, Wes, on that note, because that's a great corrective about the oversimplification of hawks and doves. Do you think in any given administration, or let's just say American administration, do you think that the State Department, the Defense Department have more, there's that popular characterization of the militant, let's go, and then the diplomat that says, let's not go. And, the Secretary of State is at odds with the Secretary of Defense or what have you. My question for you is, do you think that that's such a rash oversimplification? Because you've been on the inside. Is that a rash oversimplification? And in fact, are we finding synergy in agendas? It's just a matter of it's a matter of style and approach. What's your sense about the reality of how that plays out?
Well, I think these organs of U.S. government that you're describing, state and defense, historically, they do often, not always, but they often find themselves in countervailing positions in the interagency debate. I've seen instances where the Defense Department is taking what from the outside would look like a less hawkish approach than the State Department. What I think overall, though, the trend that I see is in the period since the end of the Cold War, the role of State Department in U.S. strategy and in interagency debates has really diminished. And the role of the Defense Department has increased considerably. And I think that's because we were in this era after the end of the Cold War, where we had the world's most powerful military. There was no peer competitor in sight. The military element of U.S. strategy really gained a lot of wasta and clout and influence. So did Treasury. So if you think of sanctions as the non-kinetic form of coercion, well, from the 90s forward, the two preferred policy instruments of U.S. strategy were the military and sanctions. We were dealing with mostly smaller actors. So think of, Slobodan Milosevic, think of Saddam Hussein, or the situation in Afghanistan. These were all small players on the periphery. This wasn't great power conflict. And so, in the immediate post-Cold War period, if you think of diplomacy as being preponderantly about compromise or, reconciling conflicting interests with a rival, there wasn't a pure competitor with whom we would have conducted great power diplomacy. So we took on the attributes really of a military empire in some ways. And I think that's reflected institutionally in the fact that Department of Defense or now Department of War and the Treasury gained in clout, while the State Department really kind of atrophied and its role became less clear. This was because of the structural environment that we were in, but also behavior bureaucratically inside State Department. So State Department grew in complexity after the Cold War, even while its classic role was diminishing. You saw a proliferation of special offices, special envoys. You saw the State Department going more deeply into progressive causes and promoting causes around the world that were mainly left progressive, but they did it under the banner of human rights. So it wasn't just that they were interested in human rights properly understood. It's that human rights became this umbrella for all kinds of things that were detached, I would argue, from the U.S. national interest. So State Department did what a lot of bureaucracies in history have done, and that is it expanded its mission. Mission creep. Right, which is part of what bureaucracies do to get more resources. But I think that's one of the more interesting things that's going on right now under Secretary Rubio, and you saw versions of it earlier under Secretary Pompeo, even Secretary Tillerson, is trying to pull the State Department back to its original reason for existence, which is to promote the national interest, and specifically to do so through the things that give you effective diplomacy. Skill in negotiations. Let's start with that. I found in my time at State Department that the as an institution, State Department basically stopped producing negotiators as a category, and put a lot more resources into things that I think fall way outside the classical functions of diplomacy. But I mean, historically, you do need a bureaucracy for diplomacy, but it tends to laser focus with the successful great powers I looked at. Your diplomatic bureaucracy focuses on training good negotiators, having a very deep, particular knowledge of other places in the world, being the repository for really knowing the languages and customs and behavior of opponents as well as allies, and being able to make the case for diplomacy as a component of strategy within, say, a national security strategy or national defense strategy. And I think State Department really atrophied in the period since the Cold War in all of those categories. And who knows, we may now be seeing a renaissance, pulling State Department back to some of its classical functions, but that demands that you trim back some of these other extraneous focuses that the institution has developed along the way.
So thank you for that. It's just incredibly insightful about kind of the way it operates from the inside. Great Britain's Lord Salisbury describes diplomacy in this interesting, I don't know if it's tongue-in-cheek, kind of a milquetoast way, but he says, quote, "There's nothing in the diplomat's achievements which appeals to the imagination. His victories are made up of a series of microscopic advantages, of a judicious suggestion here, of an opportune civility there, of a wise concession at one moment and a far-sighted persistence at another, of sleepless tact, immovable calmness, and patience that no folly, no provocation, no blunders can shake. But there is nothing exciting in the exercise of excellences such as these. The result is that while the services of a commander are celebrated with almost undiminished enthusiasm from age to age, the services of the diplomatist fade rapidly away from a nation's memory," close quote. So let me ask you this, Wes. Is he lamenting the fact that there is good work being done, but there's not statues erected? Or is he saying the work is actually sort of not as important as what the military strategists are doing? My presumption it's the former, not the latter, but what's your sense?
Yeah, I think it's more the former.
Yeah.
Salisbury was a laconic temperamental, kind of high church Anglican who was the epitome of Anglo conservatism of the 19th century. He had a deep sense of irony and paradox in his viewing of history, really believed in diplomacy, was a master in both conceptualizing and executing diplomacy. So he's certainly not lampooning diplomacy. I think he's rather, as you've said, he's calling attention. Yeah, and he's calling attention by lamenting. He's also calling attention to the actual accomplishments of diplomacy. It occurred to me about halfway through my book that one of diplomacy's problems is that its greatest accomplishments are events that don't occur.
Yeah.
So if a diplomat is doing his job well, either a war doesn't occur, a war is ended, or a war is delayed, but you don't get the wind in the hair feeling when you're reading about Richelieu or Metternich that you do when you're reading about, Frederick the Great or Napoleon.
Yeah.
That was actually one of the challenges I set for myself in the book. I had seen that quote by Salisbury pretty early on. I thought, it'd be great to try to write a book that maybe it doesn't prove Salisbury wrong, but it provides a riposte or a counterpoint that says, here's some things that have been done in history by diplomats that are not squishy, pie in the sky type stuff, but are actually hard-nosed use of diplomacy and negotiations to get an advantage in war and statecraft. Now that would be a book. That would be a book that almost creates rhetorical or written monuments for some of these unacclaimed diplomats. That some of them in the book will be familiar to readers. Bismarck, Nixon, Metternich, but some of them are lesser known individuals that diplomacy has provided a way over and over again for states to really level the playing field in some surprising ways. It's often a game of wits against superior military power, but in doing that, what you start to see, you quoted Cagliari at the start of the conversation. He had a similar kind of dyspeptic conservative mentality to Salisbury. You really start to see just how cost effective good diplomacy is for a great power. I think there's a line where Cagliari says something like, at the fraction of the cost of an army division or a battleship or whatever, you can, with really good diplomats, you can position the state to accomplish things at a fraction the cost. And that really stuck with me as well. It's a good way to think of diplomacy. Is diplomacy at its best is giving the state an instrument, a tool of survival that's way cheaper than economic or military power, and can do really phenomenal things that neither military or economic power can do. I mean, of course, I'll emphasize again, it needs to be integrated with military and economic power. But diplomacy is unique as an instrument of statecraft in being able to rearrange the chess pieces internationally to get you in a better position competitively.
Segment 2, Great Power Diplomacy. Sir Winston Churchill once claimed, quote, "Diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions," close quote. Sir Henry Wotton noted, quote, "An ambassador is an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country," close quote. And Sun Tzu observed that, quote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," close quote. So, Wes, in your book, Great Power Diplomacy, you offered vivid examples of the success and failure of diplomacy in either Byzantium and Venice, France and Austria, Germany and England, even the United States. So there's names such as Richelieu and Metternich, Bismarck, Salisbury, Nixon, and Kissinger that populate your book. So how did you decide on the case studies to feature, and what, sadly, was left on the cutting room floor?
There was so much left on the cutting room floor. God, it's books upon books that could come out of notes.
There's a sequel. There's a sequel coming.
That's right. Yeah, no, at the start, it was clear to me that I couldn't write a general history of diplomacy. And I couldn't even write a strategic history of diplomacy, that I needed to narrow the focus. So number one, I looked at the great powers of the Western tradition. I had to set aside a great chapter I had already started writing on the Song dynasty. There were others, the Mughals I had thought of, the Persians. That might be in a future book about the diplomatic traditions of the East. But so number one, I focused on the Western tradition, which is distinctive and really the birthplace of classical diplomacy. Number two, I made a point to not look at great powers that were really at the end of their rope, really in terminal decline, where diplomacy they're grasping is kind of like a last gasp of air before they go under, because that would to focus on those cases would suggest that diplomacy is only a counsel of desperation, or that it's kind of the recourse of the weak. So I chose well-known empires or kingdoms of the West that were either at their heyday or maybe in the Indian summer. They were still flush with military and economic strength. But I zeroed in further on these moments that confront great powers that are really fascinating to me, where there's a novel threat that appears. Say for the Byzantines, it was the Huns. For the United States today, it's China, where this new enemy has either novel tactics or technologies. It's something they haven't quite dealt with in their repertoire, but they can't suddenly stop and focus on that. They still have their legacy, their hereditary rivals on other points of the compass. And I think those moments are interesting. It's basically a moment where you face the biggest danger that a great power in history can face, which is a multi-front war that's beyond your ability to win with your existing military power. And those are clarifying moments because they force you to really confront what it is that you care about, what you value as a society, what you're willing to give up. And so I zeroed in on those. Those are gut-wrenching moments. And so every chapter starts with, the leaders within the cockpit of that great power who are confronted with this moment of realization. It's not crisis diplomacy, like, say, Cuban Missile Crisis, because it's not when you're on the teeth of a conflict. It's when a conflict is on the horizon. You can see that you're headed for a clash with another great power, but you still have the time to take stock and arrange things to the best of your ability to be in a better position for that competition. I think that's as pure a laboratory as you're going to get for strategic diplomacy. So that was the filter.
So Wes, in your chapter, The Eunuch and the Barbarian, we encounter the brutality of Attila and his marauding clan of Huns, matching strength and, if you will, wits with the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius the Younger and his eunuch advisor, Chrysafius. Now, you've called negotiation, earlier in our conversation, you've called negotiation diplomacy's most important function. You said negotiation is to diplomacy what skill at arms is to war. So how did negotiation play a compelling role in Byzantium's management of the wild and violent Huns? It seems like, how do you reason with, how do you parry with this kind of this ravaging mass of people coming and butchering people? And of course, there's, like you said, this is not the crisis where they're just kind of coming over the walls and so on. But how did negotiation play a role between this more sophisticated and this more brutish culture?
Yeah, great question, because this example, more than any other in the book, underscores the dichotomy between diplomacy with its disciplines, use of negotiations, with the wildness of a purely military force. I mean, the Huns come rolling in from, in the minds of the Byzantine clerics and scriveners, it's like the devil has been unleashed from the great beyond. I mean, they actually thought of them in spiritual terms. These mounted horsemen in their thousands, who would just roll through the Roman Empire, slaughter entire garrisons, crucify Roman Christians along the roadside. And initially, just like with Sthenelatus and the Spartans, it's the military faction at court that prevails, and they say, throw the army at them. And at that moment that the Huns arrive, you have to remember the Byzantine army is engrossed in a war with Persia on the eastern frontier, so hundreds of miles away from the capital, Constantinople. Another large Byzantine force is in North Africa, trying to chase the Visigoths away from their grain supply. So you've got the multi-front dynamic. But at first, the Byzantines respond by throwing their military at it. And the Huns just make mincemeat of repeated Byzantine punitive expeditions. So that's where it gets interesting, because got these guys like Chrysafius who've been in the shadows kind of lurk forward and say, let's try a different method. So the initial negotiations of the Byzantines with the Huns exemplify one of the key disciplines of diplomacy, which is really knowing your enemy. And in taking stock of, those first emissaries that went to Attila in his camp, they're coming from an institution in Constantinople that the Byzantines called the Bureau of Barbarians. Great term for like the first foreign ministry, right? We should have a Bureau of Barbarians today. That
totally.
And so they're trained in the languages of the various tribes and peoples around the empire, but more than that, they're trained to think strategically about an opponent, especially these tribal opponents. What is it that makes them tick? What does their chieftain need in order to stay in power? What motivates them? What do they want? So it quickly becomes apparent to the Byzantines through these initial entreaties to the Huns that they're horse people. They need grasslands, which means they have to kind of stay a little bit out of range of Constantinople and these plains to the north. But they want gold. That's what makes them tick. And more than that, they realize that the chieftain, the clan structure of the Huns, which is basically a confederation of tribes, that Attila's captaincy or his position of leadership depends on loot. He has to constantly get loot to feed these lesser captains who are consenting to him being the leader of them all. The minute he stops delivering loot, he's gone. He'll be deposed, and there'll be another leader in his place. And so what they hit on is this notion that they will broker agreements with the Huns that give the Huns the key thing they want, which is gold, in exchange for treaties, and they were formal treaties, even though the Huns were largely illiterate, that commit the Huns to, a certain geographic range, not going to war, so they come up with these very elaborate treaties. And the main criticism of Chrysafius, of course, at court is that this is appeasement, that he's giving gold, but what's so shrewd about Byzantine diplomacy is they're using gold to addict the Huns, to basically enmesh the Huns in the Byzantine political economy, the Byzantine system of economy and politics. The minute you stop the gold, which the Byzantines would do at key moments with a really good sense of timing, you really put the Huns on their back heels. And they're using this to buy time to shift their armies from the eastern frontier where they're fighting the Persians. They develop a peace treaty with the Persians to allow them to take the pressure off the eastern frontier. And the sum total of all of this is they're interspersing negotiations in force to get to a point where more of their army can be concentrated around Constantinople, and they can deflect the Huns towards softer targets.
Well, as a matter of fact, I remember, like you said, there was one time where this was what was striking to me, that, first of all, that you could even negotiate and parry with these people. The second thing is that it worked. That at one point they're coming, if I'm not mistaken, I think they went to the Roman Empire and they kind of spared the Byzantines, if you will. So they actively decided, we're leaving these guys alone. We're going to go over here instead. If I'm remembering that correctly, as opposed to just whatever's in our way, we're going to just, like you said, make mincemeat out of them. It was striking. And if I'm not mistaken, when Chrysafius, when he, I'm probably am I pronouncing his name right? Forgive me.
I say Chrysafius. I don't know that it matters.
When his benefactor died, and I think it was his benefactor's sister that came into power, she had him executed, if I'm not mistaken.
First to go.
And then they changed their strategy and said, let's go get them. Let's go militarily take on the Huns. And what happened?
Well, by that point, Chrysafius's diplomatic strategy has borne its fruit. The Huns face a dilemma, because if they go to war with the Byzantines, their gold flow stops. So eventually they look for easier targets. They wreak havoc in the Western Roman Empire. by the time they come back to the northern frontier of the Byzantines, they've already started to fragment. Attila dies under very mysterious circumstances. You have to remember that the Byzantines were also on numerous occasions attempting to assassinate / poison Attila. So in any event, when he dies, the Hunnic Confederation really fragments, and the Byzantines are shrewd in using gold to fragment this confederation and make sure that some are either neutralized or are not going to be. So by the time the armies of Theodosius II's successor, who has now married his sister, Pulcheria, go to blows with the Huns, they're a much reduced force. They've been fragmented. So the great tragedy or irony for Chrysafius is that his strategy does eventually pay off, so that when the military does face the Huns, they're a weakened force, but he doesn't live to see it. And the onus of a kind of appeasement is placed on his shoulders, and is the main reason that he's executed.
That's amazing. Wes, in Great Power Diplomacy, you note, quote, if as one biographer claims, Cardinal Richelieu is the Galileo statecraft, in that he conceived a European state system with France at its center, then perhaps it's not a stretch to say that Louise of Savoy is its Copernicus, and that she conceived a winning grand strategy with diplomacy at its center, close quote. So could you say a few words about who were Louise of Savoy, the mother of the 16th century French King Francis I, and the 17th century Cardinal Richelieu? Who are these two people, and how did they become early masters of diplomacy?
Well, Louise of Savoy she comes into the story as Queen Regent at a moment when Francis I of Valois King is in prison. He's been imprisoned by the Habsburgs. Francis I is a great rival of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V and the English King Henry VIII. And he is hot-blooded. We open that chapter when he's just been defeated on the battlefield. And the defeat was so thorough that he is captured by the Habsburgs. He's sitting in a prison cell. And his mother, Louise of Savoy, who's this very compelling, charismatic, intelligent queen, kind of an unsung hero from this phase of French history, steps to the fore in France and kind of takes the reins. She's got to get her son out of prison. But more than that, she has to save the Kingdom of France in the sense that the Habsburgs are winning. They're the preponderant power. We take it for granted that the Kingdom of France, would continue to exist. But at that time, the prevailing wisdom in Europe was that Charles V was building a universal empire. And that, one by one, he's taking these smaller provinces, territories, uniting them together. The Habsburgs are already in the ascendancy in the New World. So Charles V is determined to subjugate France, maybe not completely invade it and take it entirely in one fell stroke, but to subordinate it to the Habsburg crown. So Louise of Savoy, what makes her interesting in the history of diplomacy and strategy, she's not bound by any of these concepts that motivate her son of kind of like, courtly grandeur and knightly courage. She's willing to do what it takes to save France. And the first thing she does, remember at this point, the French military is busted. They're in a bad financial situation. So she sends emissaries to the Turks, way on the other side, the rear flank of the Habsburg Empire. It's a brilliant move. Nobody saw it coming because the Turks, this is the infidel. And this is an era where you risked excommunication by the church for entering into political agreements with infidels. So she sends emissaries to the Ottoman Sultan and arranges a series of commercial and military understandings that over succeeding years really put the Habsburgs in a bind. She does the same with the English, who are the hereditary enemy of the French. So she negotiates a truce with Henry VIII. And suddenly, within the course of a few months, Charles V, who previously had thought, look, I'm riding high. I've captured the French king. I've got the French on their heels. I'm getting, as soon as I wrap up this French matter, I'm going to turn my attention to the Turks. Suddenly he's in a bind because she has created a multi-front problem for the Habsburgs. She's also lighting fires inside the Habsburg Empire by using very surreptitious outreach to the Lutherans. So she creates a multi-front brush fire for Charles V. And the short and the long of it is that she really pulls Francis, she pulls Francis, her son, as well as Francis, her kingdom's chestnuts out of the fire. And it's one of the most stunning reversals of fortune in geopolitical history. Richelieu then comes later. He is chief minister to, principal minister to Louis XIII, and really using consciously or unconsciously is drawing on a strategic template that was created by Louis of Savoy, but is really bringing it to a high pitch of perfection, and builds in, 17th century France, the epitome of really what you would call the first great power, the first episode in true great power diplomacy is Richelieu, that is conducting diplomacy through professional diplomats at satellite posts all over Europe proper. Again, he's matching wits with the Habsburgs. He's using Louis of Savoy's strategic template, but he's bringing it to a higher art form by basically a professionalized diplomatic corps and a centralized foreign ministry. Just fascinating.
It is, and each of these chapters just dives deep into these. It's amazing. Harry Truman once said, "The only thing new in the world is a history you don't know." And as I'm reading this, I'm like, my gosh, the dramas that were unfolding in Central Europe from chapter to chapter of your book. It's just stunning what I thought I knew and I didn't. I want to move into Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich. He recognized Habsburg vulnerabilities. So externally, they're geographically exposed to powerful enemies. Internally, they're exposed to restive subjects. And he also recognized the need to substitute cunning for strength. So in the alliances that Metternich crafted and legal entanglements he wove, he observed, quote, "I have a feeling that I am in the middle of a web which I am spinning in the style of my spiders. A net of this kind is good to behold, woven with artistry and strong enough to withstand a light attack, even if it cannot survive a mighty gust of wind," close quote. So Wes, how did such an insecure Austro-Hungarian empire survive for so long? And many talk about this kind of century without quote unquote meaningful war following Metternich's designs from whatever the Congress of Vienna until World War I, 1814 to 1914, or 1815 to 1914. How did the Austro-Hungarian Empire survive for so long, only to collapse when it seems that Metternich's wisdom was discounted?
Well, the Austrian Empire is a subject close to my heart, and you see in Metternich and in his predecessor, one of his predecessors, Kaunitz, which was also his father-in-law, a theme in the Austrian chapter that's similar to what we were just talking about with the French, which is playing a weak hand really well.
Yeah,
and you can think of the Austrians as especially good at diplomacy because they had to be. When deprived of a consistently successful military, which the Austrians with their polyglot empire very rarely excelled at warfighting, this led them to place even greater emphasis and cultivate skills in diplomacy. Their geography also contributed to that because we're talking about the multi-front dilemma as the frame that I'm using to look at diplomacy. The Austrians had it really bad. They've got enemies on every side: the Ottomans, the French, the Prussians, the Russians. So you really can't sleep. And what the Habsburgs excelled at over time, I think it became part of the culture of their diplomacy. You can find examples where it was written down, but for the most part, I think this just became part of the working DNA of their diplomacy, was manipulating the factor of time. And doing that by creating these legal and political frameworks that enmeshed Austria's rivals into a common system or purpose that had Austria at its center. And after the Napoleonic Wars, Metternich really brings this to a very high art form in the construction of the Vienna system. And even for people who are casually aware of Metternich or the long peace of the 19th century, I think it may come as a surprise just how weak his hand really was and how well he played it. He essentially set up the House of Austria, the House of Habsburg, to be kind of an icon of treaty rights and the deep political legitimacy that comes from being Europe's oldest monarchy. So Napoleon has just been defeated. Napoleon, of course, came to represent the negation of the Ancien regime, and he's basically setting up the Habsburg monarchy as a counterpoise to the forces of revolution and chaos that were unleashed by the French and culminated in Napoleon. And so what he does at Vienna in this Congress after the war it's essentially a series of deals that he's doing bilaterally with different great powers, but then packaging the whole in a system of consultation, where, say, let's say the Russian Tsar has a shared stake in the preservation of the Austrian Empire, because if the Austrians succumb to revolution, the Tsar is going to be next. Yeah. So Metternich very cunningly entices these other great powers into helping maintain a system with Austria at its core that allows the Austrians to spend less money on defense, rely more on diplomacy and external alliances, and over time really stabilize themselves after what had been a long and bruising war. And the system that Metternich creates is justly seen as one of the greatest accomplishments of Western statecraft. It brings about one of, if not the longest, structural peace, meaning a peace without a general conflict among the great powers, a systemic war, for nearly a century, and it's quite impressive.
Wes, going on in your book, Metternich's wife notes at one point, if Metternich's idea of revenge was to invite an enemy for dinner, Bismarck's idea of revenge was to eat his enemy for dinner. And you explained that Bismarck would systematically destroy the person's career, reputation, and finances. The more public the humiliation, the better. You even further note, quote, the North Star for Bismarck was Germany. As an extension of Prussian power, Bismarck's philosophy was realpolitik, the service of the state as an end in itself. He was perfectly willing to ally with whatever faction or foreign power the circumstance required, as long as doing so advanced that end. What I have been asked whether I was pro-Russian or pro-Western, Bismarck said, I have always answered, I am Prussian. As soon as it was proved to me that it was in the interest of a healthy and well-considered Prussian policy, I would see our troops fire on French, Russians, English, or Austrians with equal satisfaction, close quote. Now, despite all this, because I'm just reading this, and I've read a number of things on Bismarck over the years and so on, but it just brings us further home. Despite all this, Bismarck seeing just the iron chancellor and this almost heartless individual, he worked tirelessly to avoid war. Can you demystify the paradox that was Otto von Bismarck? Or maybe that's another book down the road for Wess Mitchell, but give us your sense about Bismarck.
If there's one person in history I would most love to go back in time and have lunch with, it would probably be Bismarck. A man of great insecurity, enormous genius, just volcanic personality, and full of passion and contradiction. And even the look of him, people associate him with militarism, and he's always towering figure, and especially in those days. But he's always depicted in a Prussian pickelhaube helmet and cuirassier uniform, reserve. I think he was reserve cavalry, but he looks the part of a militarist. He looks the part of a Prussian warmonger.
Yeah,
but that is the paradox. You put your finger on it, and I try to develop that a little bit in the chapter on Imperial Germany, that he's actually a force for peace and stability in Europe, and he's pitted against these individuals in the Prussian general staff of that time that he called the demigods, and they're the coterie of young staff officers around Helmut von Moltke, who is the chief of the Prussian general staff, that's the architect of these great military victories of that time against France and Austria. Bismarck's aim is to build a unified German state. The military has an important role to play in that, obviously, especially early on in the string of defeats of neighbors of Prussia that create the space for it to then unify the smaller German principalities under the Prussian aegis, and that gives us unified Germany. But what Bismarck sees that the generals don't see, and it's rooted in this multi-front dilemma that I'm describing in every chapter, is that if this new German pole at the center of Europe behaves in a predatory manner, eventually the other states in that system will combine against it and strangle it in the cradle. Now, the Prussian and later German general staff, they have a solution for this multi-front problem, and it's this fantastic war machine that they're perfecting, which specializes in the art of sequencing, defeating one opponent at a time. So the Prussians have this notion that if the worst case scenario comes along and France and Russia, so the powers on either side of Germany, combine against it, right? So that's the two-front nightmare that keeps Bismarck awake at night. The Prussian general staff says, we can handle that. We've got railroads. We've got armies that can lick anybody. We'll shuttle them over here. We'll defeat the Russians first and then the French, or vice versa, or whatever. But what Bismarck sees is that it's not only the question of a near-term war, which he very much wants to avoid, but longer term. If he can't anchor this new central power in Europe in a system of diplomatic intensive security rather than military intensive security, meaning treaties with your opponents, they're very intricate, they're complicated, it requires a lot of artistry. But if you ever reach a point as the central power where you're primarily relying on your army to secure you, come what may, you will eventually succumb. And of course, long term, he's proven right, both in the First World War and in World War II. But he sees this nightmare. He sees this problem for Germany, that its virtue and what allows Prussia to unify Germany is its strength. Its main problem is its strength, because that will inevitably trigger reactions from the other great powers to combine against it. So the entirety of his diplomatic career from the unification of Germany forward is to prevent that. And he does this with an astonishingly complex web of treaties and alliances that are aimed at keeping Russia very close to Germany above all costs, balancing that with keeping Austria out of war with Russia. Austria at this point is basically a military dependent of Germany, and bringing Britain into the scales when needed for stability. But the overall purpose is to isolate France and to keep France in a position where it does not have a viable option to court as an ally any of these other players, but especially Russia, because again, the two-front problem on either side of Germany. And he does it masterfully. My chapter focuses on how he handled the 1887 Bulgarian crisis when we had the conditions in place for the First World War, before the First World War. He's just a fascinating figure, kind of the opposite of Metternich.
By the way, that what you said about the notion of diplomacy doesn't get credit for what didn't happen. That 1887 Bulgarian crisis was a great example of that. That it was like, I can honestly say I wasn't really familiar with that, and to say this could have resulted in a general conflagration, but in fact was avoided.
Yes, I think that's right. I think there are a series of moments in European history where you can see wars that might have occurred, or situations where a great power wasn't ready for war yet. So in some cases, it's war avoidance. More often, it's a case of delaying war. Again, the Council of Archidamus, to get yourself in a better spot, a better position to either deter war or, if necessary, to fight it. And I think there are a string of those, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, where you had very seasoned senior diplomats that were consciously trying to avoid this hornet's nest of the European state system of that period from exploding. But I think that's part of the reason that diplomats are either not remembered very well, or like Bismarck, they're misremembered. It's easier to think of Bismarck as, great Prussian Junker war maker against
Yeah.
Denmark and Austria and France than it is to think of him as the guy who prevented World War One before World War One.
Wes, Henry Kissinger is portrayed as the preeminent diplomat of the modern age, and you feature him with Nixon in the situation of China, obviously. Can you speak a little bit to Kissinger's strengths and his weaknesses?
Well, Kissinger's strengths, I think, all revolve around this ability to think in the way of the old world, old Europe, with its tragedies, the balance of power. Some of the qualities of classical diplomacy that I was describing a moment ago that go back centuries. The idea of an essentially tragic state of affairs and human nature being fallen, settling for less than perfect outcomes, equipoise, balance of power. These are not necessarily natural to the American mind and the American tradition of statecraft. We can talk more about that later. I mean, there is a very distinctive American tradition of it's almost like an Anglo-American commercial realist streak in us from the beginning. But this old world sensibility that Kissinger brings, I mean, he is an artifact of old Europe, a refugee of old Europe. And he is one of a handful of individuals, Robert Strauss-Hupé is another, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who are really, they're refugees from a Europe that is cannibalizing itself. And they understand in their bones, both the potentialities and the necessity of classical diplomacy, but also the inevitable tragedies and the fact that you're, aspiring at most for compromised outcomes or limited outcomes. So I think that's one. I think the other is Kissinger. He had a grasp for human nature, and I think specifically he understood how people acted in situations of power. He was drawn to those settings. He was a student of history. He was a student of the era of Metternich and Castlereagh that we were just talking about a moment ago. So he's really steeped in history and in this classical tradition of power politics in Europe. He has an eye for the main chance and is willing to climb the ladder to form a deep relationship with the guy at the top, and he does that masterfully with Richard Nixon. Their personalities really mesh well. I think he provided a conceptual layer and an intellectual legitimization, being a Harvard professor, that Nixon was drawn to, and that Nixon, in some sense, needed as someone who lacked those credentials. And I think they made a good pair because Nixon, with his background on Capitol Hill and in the private sector, he was an instinctive negotiator. They spoke the same language, but I think they balanced each other out. And the weakness of Henry Kissinger, if you wanted to put it that way, I would say, at least from my perspective, this is my opinion, that at heart he was a philosopher. And specifically, he was concerned with the philosophy of history, like where is history going? And he latches on early in life to the writings of Immanuel Kant, who was a German idealist and writer of the late 18th, early 19th century. And Kant had this idea that nations eventually will find kind of perpetual peace, that they'll form like a proto-UN type structure. They'll adjudicate their disputes the way that you would in a court of law. And, we were talking about the paradox of Bismarck a moment ago. The paradox of Kissinger is that we think of him as the high priest of realpolitik, which to an extent he was, but at heart, he was also an idealist. And Neil Ferguson makes that point.
I was going to say Neil Ferguson's book.
Very, very, very makes the point very well. But the thing to remember about Kissinger is all the way to the end of his life, he believed that the job of a diplomat was to move history along towards these plateaus where, by degrees, you eventually get to this point where the nation state no longer matters. So in a way, the diplomat is working as the handmaiden of the nation state, but with the goal of undermining and eventually replacing the nation state. Mm-hmm. And this is my main problem with Kissinger. I think it actually got worse with age because, in a way, I think he thought of himself as trying to launder his reputation, or maybe that's the wrong word for it. He was looking for a way to put the accomplishments of his statecraft, which were very realist and hard-nosed and often morally antiseptic. He wanted to package that in the worldview and kind of the breadth of vision of a senior statesman who, his last books about things like, the book that he wrote on world order was really a plea for a pan-national or a supranational global structure. And I think that departs from what I see as the essence of classical diplomacy, which has not been utopian.
Yeah.
It's been, again, tragic. It's putting limits on power, the accumulation of power, and it's at the service of a specific political community, which is the nation state. And the final thing I'll say about Kissinger is I think on some level, he never fully understood or was comfortable with the United States that became his home. I think one of the reasons he was such a good tandem with Nixon is that Nixon had a consummate understanding of American democracy and deal making and horse trading. And I don't think Kissinger I think he somewhat disdained the American system. He certainly looked down his nose at the American diplomatic tradition and often described it in sort of, in a parody in a lot of his working, but in a lot of his diplomatic work. But I think that would be my chief complaint of what was otherwise, one of the truly great statesmen of all time. But I think at heart, he never let go of this idea that the statesman isn't just serving the interests of his country or achieving national security. He's moving history along towards some sort of goal. And in this sense, it departs very much from the conservative tradition of classical diplomacy.
We're going to go into this in our next segment after this final question here. It makes me think of, I too am a subscriber to the tragic sensibility of the way the world works. And it strikes me that everybody would love to aspire to a heaven on earth, but we just know that even if you don't believe in heaven, which obviously we as Catholics do, the bottom line is that it never goes the way you think, this heaven on earth thing. As Eric Vogelin would say, and Buckley would popularize, you can't immanentize the eschaton. You can't render onto earth the heaven onto earth. And when you try to do that vis-a-vis the utopian projects of communism, the utopian project of National Socialism, the utopian project of the French Jacobins, and so on and so forth, it ends up in horror shows and so on. And so to your point, it strikes me that these examples of classic diplomacy are born out of the fact that when we've tried the bigger project, it went horribly, horribly wrong. And so whether we've backed into it away from the utopian notion, or secondly, we just know ourselves. We know that we are dignified, we're fallible, but we're redeemable, but our ultimate redemption ain't on this side of the grave. It's on the other side of the grave. We're going to do the best we can to muddle along with right. The best deals we can, the realpolitik or whatever the case may be. And this whole story, it strikes me that every chapter of your book is identifying people that said, how do we make this work? Because we have clay feet, and it's the best way we can do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's a key insight. And it's important to grasp what you just said when you're trying to understand the mind of Henry Kissinger. Yeah. Because you're talking about an individual who was a refugee from the carnage of Europe, this great self-immolation of Europe in the 20th century. The Holocaust. Many of his family members he's a Jewish immigrant. Many of his family members are killed in the Holocaust, and he's been raised in German civilization, which you go back to the 20th century and you remember, Germany in some ways, if you went to 1920s, 1930s, this was the future. If you were a European, you looked at Germany as the future of technology, math, sciences. Yeah. They were a people of great learning. So when this all comes apart, I'm not the first one to say this, but I think it's true that, Kissinger then, he finds himself in the new world, and he's an artifact of the old world, and he's as an agnostic, he's given up on any potentiality for God. And more than that, I think sees, like some of that era did, he sees the carnage of Europe as a very clear indication that there isn't a higher morality or a higher, let's say, there's not a God. There's not. This Christian worldview that you're describing differs from Kissinger's worldview. And I'd go a step further and say that then what the philosophy of history, is history going anywhere? That then fills the place in Kissinger, in his motivations and what he understands to be the higher or the highest outworking of your labor on earth. There's nothing higher than to create a state of affairs on earth in which war is not possible, and where you're not repeating the Holocaust and you're not repeating World War II. So I think, as one of his European biographers had pointed out, stability becomes morality for Kissinger. But the reason he is so attached to the idea of stability through the balance of power is that it becomes a form of morality because it's avoiding war. And it's not just avoiding war. Eventually, it's going to get us to this Kantian utopia. And I think he really believed that we would eventually arrive, or that should be our purpose, where wars are no longer possible. So that becomes a surrogate for morality or a higher, a higher story or a higher purpose.
What a striking, that is a paradox in a guy who is, like you said, he's so reputed as and practiced the realpolitik kind of approach. Not to say you can't aspire for greater things, and obviously a person becomes more I don't want to say sentimental, but more philosophic at the end of their life about where we're going to go here on Earth. But the bottom line is that it just the ability to arrive at what you're describing, he wanted us to arrive at. It just runs. I hate to say it, just runs contrary to experience, and his life kind of embodies that. But then we're getting into delving into the nuances of one's mind and where they hope for and so on. I want to, before we finish this segment, Wes, I want to ask you the big question in the study of diplomacy is the impact of the great man versus the vast impersonal forces. The great man theory and so on. What are you learning about this argument about is history dictated by great men? You could say great women. Or are these people just right place, right time, but vast impersonal forces are the things that move history this way and that? And the answer could be yes, it's both and. But what did you learn from your experience, but also from all this study about that question?
Well, I've always been firmly in the former camp. I think history moves along because of the choices, including the moral choices of individual humans, and particularly our leaders. And writing this reinforced that for me, and perhaps that was inevitable because I was choosing to write about history from the standpoint of groups of leaders, the choices that they had. But it was so easy for me in these chapters to see with little effort how differently history might have gone if there were a different person or a person of different qualities in a certain position at a certain moment. And maybe you see that more in diplomacy, even than military history, because as using the Salisbury quote from a moment ago, it's about these micro advantages or these, a careful choice of timing in a particular move or a particular tactic. So maybe you're more attuned to the psychological element when you're dealing with diplomacy because it's happening in the realm of the mind, much more than warfare. But military and diplomatic history, it really reinforced for me in the book that there are these turning points where I think the structural matters, and it's very significant. You can't understate it. It's the furniture, it's the setting. It places constraints on the realm of the possible for even the most impressive and effective of leaders. So, Winston Churchill, upper limits of what an individual can achieve from a position of leadership with maximum talents, but within the constraints of a dying empire, and its cockpit is a little island off the coast of Europe, doesn't have a lot of natural resources. United States and Soviet Union are rising. So, I think the individual does move history, And I think you have to understand history first and foremost in those terms. It's the result of choices that individuals made, fallen by nature, flawed individuals. But as kind of the approach I took in the book, unless you are understanding what given leaders had for breakfast, who they loved, what they feared, you can't really understand why history went the way that it did. And I think if you only, in sort of a Marxist way, if you only look at the structural forces, it's not only less rich descriptively, like the panoply of history in some sense is sort of economized if it's just structural forces, but it's also a more misleading guide to the future. It gives you, if it's all structural, it gives you sort of this parsimonious framework that time and again, you will find yourself surprised by history if the outcome is determined by these structural forces. And that, today with the United States and China, I mean, if you did nothing but focus on the structural forces, it might lead you to assume, things in the U.S.-China relationship that aren't in fact where we're headed. But I mean, I think you have to look at the leader and the individual, and then think about the structural piece as a constraint on the art of the possible.
Hi, I'm Tod Worner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Diplomacy and Human Nature. In Great Power Diplomacy, Wess Mitchell insists, quote, "At a time when reality itself seems startlingly malleable, history is a reminder of certain constraints that do not change, geography, human nature, and the logic of strategy being chief among those. History is a good solvent to hubris and to the conceit that we moderns know everything and can solve everything," close quote. So, Wes, this is probably one of my favorite segments, even though the first two I think were just terrific. What lessons have you learned about human nature in your research for this book? And how can studying history help us understand ourselves and our opposites?
Yeah, I appreciate you framing this as one of the topics for discussion, because human nature really is the substrate of the chapters of my book. There's a great line by an English philosopher named Collingwood who said, history is what man is and what we've done. It's what we've done and therefore who we are. Mm-hmm. I think the limiting factors of geography, history, human nature, if you understood or tried to understand nothing but those three things, you would still have a pretty good grasp on the things that matter most for understanding human events. In every one of my chapters, the storyline is built around a handful of individuals. Again, what the dashboard looked like from their perspective. They were deeply flawed in all kinds of ways. I mean, the full panoply of vices is covered by the characters in these chapters. Yeah. Most of them had pretty healthy egos. A few of them were fools. Mm-hmm. You've got, drunkards and knaves and people who, some of these people, I don't know that you would have looked at them as a paragon of virtue, but, understanding their human makeup, their psychology, the times in which they lived, that's one of the challenges too. I think human nature is a constant. So I don't see anything about individuals that's changed since the time of Thucydides. But the context matters enormously in terms of how people think about what's important, how they conceive of power. what sacrifices they're willing to make and for what ends. And so I really try in the book to bring that element into the story. And I think it's necessary for understanding, the motivations of rulers, but also the limits that they run up against. And in some ways, you're even more impressed when great turns of events occur, and these master chess players. You're all the more impressed when you realize that they were made from the crooked timber of humanity.
Yeah. You made me think about, I don't, you probably have read Charlie Hill's work, Grand Strategies, and kind of his, integrating literature into, diplomacy or the history of grand strategy and so on. And one of the things that I think he lamented in an interview with actually Peter Robinson over at, I think it was Uncommon Knowledge, was he talked about the notion that all these kids going to college and studying international relations are learning issues, but they're not learning context. And as you just described, I love the notion of human nature is unchanged, but context changes. And understanding how human nature plays out in those different contexts will make all the difference in, whether you go this way or you go that way. So I think it's a fascinating observation. Wes, until modern times, you've written, and I love this insight, diplomacy was conducted with a great deal of pessimism. And reading these chapters, you're like, I wonder why. No, but was that because experience had the tragic sensibility, experience, an apprehension of human nature, and even more importantly, what are the dangers of the modern unrealistic expectations that sort of kind of bypass the fallibility of human nature, that bypass the notion that we can't achieve perpetual peace or a utopia on Earth? What's your sense?
Yeah, I think historically, there's been a deeper awareness for most of Western history than there is in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, that war is the natural state of man. We're an aggressive species. We're a territorial species. And so the pessimism that I see, or the tragic sensibility, is rooted in a willingness to grapple with reality. That, if you're Metternich and your daughter is dying of a sickness in the next room, you've just seen 20 years of almost interrupted warfare with Napoleon, your state is bankrupt, the upper limits, the ceiling or the horizon that you're looking to it's not the world of Immanuel Kant for sure. You're looking at best to carve out a season of stability amidst what will inevitably be the overall tragedy of the human story. So you're not under any illusions. This is what you look to at most. And so, for Metternich, just using that example, to aspire to the maximal imaginable state of the positive would be he would anchor it to the sovereign he served. So it would be to secure the House of Habsburg as a permanent fixture of the European state system, to achieve for its peoples as much of a tranquility and stability as possible, free as war, as free from great power war for as long as possible. So these were, these were the upper ceilings of what was achievable. So by modern lights, that is pessimistic, because especially since the Cold War, I think modern liberal, the liberal mentality has been the most maximal horizons. We're going to transcend war itself. We're going to abolish war from the human experience. We're going to have the Lexus and the olive tree, this globalized world that was the idea for many years, 1990s onward. But it was this notion that we're not. Again, I'm going back to the concepts of constraints and limits that kind of permeate the book in different ways. It's a world without limits. You're not limited by geography or human nature, and certainly not by history. I mean, I think the modern Western liberal mindset looks at history as something to be discarded and transcended. It's like a source of shame. But the potentialities are suddenly limitless. It's this brave new world. You're going to enmesh your rivals into a system of liberal economics, and eventually they're going to liberalize politically as well. And over time, you're moving upward. History is going somewhere.
Yeah.
It's a Whiggish teleology. You're moving towards a sunny horizon. And whether you want to talk about it in terms of Kant and perpetual peace, or it's more of the tech lords nowadays that, you put great hope in technology to perfect mankind. I mean, it's meliorism, right? It's the perfection of mankind through some. So I think in the modern era, I mean, basically the period since the Cold War, one reason that diplomacy shrunk in importance, I mean, I described this setting where we haven't until recently had a peer competitor, but it's that in this modern setting, we hit on these things that we thought would be substitutes for diplomacy. They're more elegant or efficient. So multilateral institutions, or military technology. So those are the two opposite ends of the spectrum. But either way, there's something man-made, either institutions or technology, that's going to lift us out of the pessimism and tragedy of war and geopolitics and be our salvation on this earth. I think it's very strong in the modern mind.
Yeah, I'll just give an example. I think a little bit. So, obviously, Woodrow Wilson. You have Franklin Roosevelt with the United Nations. I mean, I was thinking about this when I was preparing some questions for you. I was thinking about Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at Yalta, and the way I know Roosevelt obviously was savvy and deft and so on, but there was a part of him, it seems, that, and obviously he was sick, and who knows, there might have been some compromise and so on. But the part of it seems like, and forgive me if I hope there aren't Roosevelt fans out there that think I'm being a little bit hard on him, but it did seem like he felt like the force of his personality and his charm and so on, that he could kind of win Stalin over, but also that at the end of the day, we can kind of put together this structure that not only will hem in the worst parts of what it means to be human, but maybe we'll arrive at something sort of Kantian with the United Nations.
Right.
Whereas Churchill was like, are you kidding me? This is, he's signing the percentages agreement with Stalin behind the scenes about how do we kind of divide up Europe, because frankly, we're not going east, and he's definitely he's staying west. It just strikes me that this sort of hope against hope that often finds itself in certain Western intellectual climes plays right into the hands of the jungle, the jungle that's out there, and the aspirations of human nature, the darkness of human nature that's just beneath the skin's level. It's vexing to me. It's vexing to me, and I don't know if that's because people have they've left heaven out of a God's realm, because they don't believe in God anymore, and they say it's somehow we want to hope we can bring it here. It's an arrogance of progress. It's Hegelian, if you will, maybe a little Marx. I'm kind of lumping this all together. But what's your sense about this perpetual tendency that we can immanentize the eschaton in some fashion here, whereas diplomacy and warfare and the human condition from time immemorial says, guys, this just doesn't work here. It doesn't work here. What's your sense?
Yeah, what you're describing is very real. I think Americans have a particular susceptibility to what you're describing.
Yeah.
Churchill was a child of the old world, and he was thinking in Victorian terminology. I mean, he was thinking in terms that would have been understandable to Salisbury. So he was thinking in terms of the balance of power. The balance of power is as the sturdiest structure that humans have so far found to prevent great power war. In anything above that, so when Churchill thought about the role of the United Nations, he was thinking about, at most, an entity that would, in which the balance of power could be played out. He wasn't looking for a structure to supersede and kind of like take the venom out of the human experience. FDR, on the other hand, in the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, is much more susceptible to kind of American idealism. And I hasten to add, and I'm clear about this in the American chapter of my book, there is a fine tradition in the United States back through Teddy Roosevelt all the way to Madison, this kind of pragmatic sensibility of, for lack of a better term. I mean, I think it was a conservative realism. But the dominant strand so often for us has been to grasp onto the maximal liberal, modern view of history. And it is that this idea that really is rooted in the Enlightenment and starts to grow. I mean, it's an outworking of Immanuel Kant, who is a child of the Enlightenment. But it's this idea that man, through reason, can tame what had seemed like these permanent tragic forces of geography and history and human nature through schemes of efficiency, reason, that this will tame war and thereby tame human nature and what it is to be man. And that's very alive and well with us now, particularly on the left. But I think I think Americans are. I think we tend to be more susceptible to it because of our unique history and the fact that unlike the Europeans, we, as difficult as North America was as an environment in which to create a republic, we were not pressed cheek by jowl up against all of these rivals like the Europeans were for centuries. And we have oceans on either side of us. We have smaller players around us. So I think, for a guy like Wilson to imagine these very broad horizons of kind of transcending war and creating a league where nations will adjudicate disputes the way that you do inside of a democracy, I don't think that was a big leap for him. And FDR, his naivete vis-a-vis Stalin is just breathtaking.
Yeah.
And so many needless setbacks and tragedies of the second half of the 20th century can be rooted in this very naive outlook on our ability to transcend these permanent constraints.
Yeah. Wes, in his essay, The Greatest of All Novels, exploring Tolstoy's War and Peace, Gary Saul Morrison writes, and forgive me, this is a little bit of a longer excerpt, but Gary Saul Morrison writes, quote, "But in a world of contingency, presentness makes a difference. What are we facing tomorrow?" Prince Andrei asked his friend Pierre before the Battle of Borodino. 100 million chances, which will be decided on the instant by whether we run or they run, whether this man or that man is killed. No one can foresee whom a particular bullet will kill, and yet how soldiers react to such contingencies makes all the difference. War and Peace's wisest general, Commander-in-Chief Kutuzov, understands this fact about battle and about life from the start. At the Council of War before Austerlitz, Kutuzov dozes off. At last, he cuts the meeting short. "Gentlemen, the disposition," he says, "for tomorrow, or rather for today, for it is past midnight, cannot be altered now. And before a battle, there is nothing more important," he paused, "than a good night's sleep." Close quote. If the world of human beings were amenable to science, then planning would be most important. But in a world governed by contingency, where immediate reactions to unexpected events matters more, one above all needs alertness. Close quote. So in great power diplomacy, where does the aid of science end and the wisdom of experience, common sense, intuition, and gestalt begin? So in effect, in diplomacy, how often has theory gotten in the way of practice, and is diplomacy an art or a science? I'm giving you a couple of different variations on the same question.
Yeah, thanks for reading that passage. I'm a big fan of Tolstoy. I think in the period since the end of the Cold War, American diplomacy fell into a trap of seeing diplomacy as a science of peace. It's a science of administration. So think of, USAID and the State Department are going to go into Afghanistan after the soldiers have mopped things up, and through the right mixture of aid and training in Western concepts about whatever, democracy or how women should be treated or whatever, with that right mixture of administrative inputs, we're going to achieve an outcome almost mechanically that is converting a society into, rendering a society into a more modern form. So I think there's a very strong dose of that, especially since the end of the Cold War. I mean, more broadly, the American diplomatic tradition has had a big legalistic strand. We were talking about FDR and Wilson and how they were wanting to create these grand structures. I mean, FDR saw the United Nations after World War II as the more sort of the perfection of the failed League of Nations model.
Yeah.
But it's a grander version of this idea of diplomacy as an administrative science. You get the right mix of institutions. All people are rational actors. The history of the Russians You're just interacting with it. This is an interchangeable human form. Sort of utility maximizing creatures are all that humans are. This kind of thing. So I think that's been very strong. What I think is interesting about diplomacy, it's very much an art in my mind. Mm-hmm. That compared to other forms of power that I was talking about a moment ago, so say military power or economic coercion, the mediums or the means of diplomacy have changed the least, because they correspond most to the features of human nature and changeability. It's negotiation, it's persuasion. The way that you reach a deal through negotiations today is not that different when you strip it to its essence. Persuasion, leverage, negotiations. These are all things that are much less changing over time than, say, how we make war today compared to Thucydides' time has changed tremendously. So I think what we're seeing now with the return of great power diplomacy, and we're very much seeing that in the world right now. The United States right now, we've got major diplomatic talks of various kinds underway with all three of our main rivals. And so I think what you see is the return of diplomacy as an art. Whether we succeed in each of these cases or not will come down more down to our ability to wield diplomacy in the way that it was wielded historically, and have nothing to do with the administrative science that we came to think of in diplomacy in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Wes, as I think about the many lessons offered in your book, one word returns to mind again and again, and that is efficacy. Isn't the diplomat's central hope that they will achieve their desired ends? And as such, does that mean that our diplomats that we're training nowadays, as have been sort of trained in the past, are to some extent masters of calculation, experts at reading the room, and even savants at understanding their own biases and blind spots?
Yes, I think that's a good way to think about it. My understanding of the reforms that are underway right now at State Department under Secretary Rubio is that it's an attempt to move diplomacy back to the core reason for the existence of a State Department, which is things like a professionalized foreign service, the ability to have retain really deep reservoirs of knowledge about foreign cultures and negotiating. I was surprised when I was at State Department how little those things were emphasized. I can remember we were in very important negotiations with a serious foreign power over something that really mattered, and in the Middle East. And I asked in our bureau, who are the old salts in the State Department, who are really like no nonsense negotiators? I could really use their advice on a couple of these points, like tactically and it was just silence. It's because the State Department doesn't see itself as cultivating or producing great negotiators. I think contrast that with the mentality that our opponents in, say, Russia or China have about diplomacy. I remember seeing at one point a translated copy of the Russian diplomatic manual that's given to Russian diplomats on how to approach negotiations. And there's chapters for different countries that the Russians interact with. So in the American chapter, the Russians are teaching their diplomats to know certain things about the American proclivity, our culture, the attitude that it produces. It's telling them how everything down to their body language when they enter the room, when to escalate rhetorically in a conversation, when to back down, how to toggle the pressure up and down. But they're looking at it through the prism of the culture of their interlocutors. So they would take a different approach than, say, if they were negotiating with the Europeans or the Chinese. Now, whether you think that's you can perfect it in this way or not, the point is, our rivals look at diplomacy as a strategic discipline. The line from Zhu and Lai in the book, the Chinese counterpart to Kissinger, that the line about how in a speech to a graduating class of Chinese diplomats, he tells them, we have for our state to survive, we have the pen and we have the sword. You're the pen. You are soldiers out of uniform. So it's this mentality of the diplomat as rendering a critical service that comes about through skill and these kind of age-old things, but applying yourself to it as a strategic discipline, that has been absent in the United States for a very long time, and we're going to have to regain it. Now that we're in an environment where we've got to deal with these guys.
Wes, each chapter, and especially the final chapter in Great Power Diplomacy, is devoted to articulating the indispensable rules of diplomacy. And a few such rules include, among others, first, diplomacy concentrates power. Second, conciliate to restrain, not to appease. Third, interests outweigh ideology. Fourth, the little guys matter. 5, in negotiation, culture counts. 6, successful diplomats barely get thanked. There's more. These are fantastic. Was it hard for you you did such a nice job throughout this book identifying the evolution of the art of diplomacy, but also the tried and true tenets that almost need to be resurrected, as you said, in the modern era. Was it hard to kind of distill it down to these rules, or would you say no? It's returning to the fundamentals again and again and again, and these are fundamental. It's staring us right in the face. It's just a matter of applying them.
It actually helped me to compare different examples. So when you're neck deep in, you're reading about the French and how they're negotiating with the Turks in the 16th century, you can get lost in the details.
Yeah.
But one thing that I tried to use the examples to do for myself, I was using the book to also instruct myself and understand and learn, is the comparison helps you because it, across the cases when you gain altitude and you start trying to find the common threads. And near the top of the list that you just read, one that stood out to me so strongly, some were harder than others to glean, but one that was just so crystal clear is the idea of diplomacy's, that diplomacy is used to place constraints on an opponent. So this modern idea that diplomacy, I think you see it in Woodrow Wilson, Neville Chamberlain, that the other guy is reasonable, that any problem must be the result of a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And we're going to get to diplomacy's job is to clear up the misunderstanding. We're rational modern guys. There must be a misunderstanding. Reasonable men can get in the room and use diplomacy to clear up the misunderstanding. I don't see that in history at all. All of these earlier pre-modern cases that I'm looking at, they look at diplomacy as a political expedient, not to trick an opponent. That's more the Eastern tradition, but to find some convention or understanding that will place constraints on his ability to do the maximum negative thing he can to you. Now, that's going to require you to give up something, but the logic is constraints. And so just singling out that sort of arch lesson across the cases, it was so crystal clear to me that, I think in the modern era, you can use that as a standard and say, the further you get away from a logic of constraints in diplomacy, the more likely you are to fail. So, Neville Chamberlain, one of the examples of a big failure of diplomacy in my book. It becomes very clear to me in studying Chamberlain. He's a supremely confident guy.
Yeah.
And he took a personal hand in the diplomacy. He's basically running diplomacy, British diplomacy, with Hitler through himself and one amateur intermediary. He has this, even though he was a Tory, he has the modern liberal mindset. If I can get in the room with this guy, I'm going to clear up the misunderstandings.
Yeah.
I think FDR is proceeding from the same kind of new diplomacy type mindset. And what he departs from is hundreds of years of British diplomatic tradition that was focused not on clearing up misunderstandings, which is a fallacy, but using the balance of power to place constraints on an opponent's continental power's ability to do you harm. And who knows whether those constraints would have succeeded or failed. They might have failed, but they were available to him. So using the tried and true methods of alliances with the smaller powers on the continent, including France, that are threatened by Germany, by the potential hegemon. This was a tried and true, but the point is, it's rooted in this age-old notion that the goal of diplomacy isn't to remove obstacles; it's to place constraints on an opponent. Yeah. So things like that were really clear to me. Some of the others took a little bit more time to kind of reread and reflect across the cases, but I'd say most of them they show up like really bright lines that run through the history of diplomacy.
Two questions, because Wes, you've been so generous with your time, but this first one is kind of a fun one. You walk into the pantheon of diplomats, you get to walk out with one of them that's going to be your key diplomat in some circumstance. Who do you pick?
That's a tough one.
I know.
It'd be a toss up between Metternich and Bismarck, and their methods were very different, and they excelled with different kinds of problems. But Metternich was so suave, and he had this ability to go into a room that had 15 different views and leave with the room with only one view, or with assent to a common set of principles. It's really remarkable. But in the end, it would probably be Bismarck. I think while he was more forceful and his tactics were often draconian, thought of in terms of diplomacy as a tool for navigating human nature, he was a master. He could get in the room with someone, and he's kind of like almost like a early German version of the Johnson treatment, what they said of LBJ. I mean, he was, in one sentence he's charming, and the next he's threatening. But his ability to just get unlikely favorable outcomes out of all kinds of situations, and then in his mind connect those various dots. There was a higher math there with Bismarck. Unfortunately, I think it wasn't very replicable, and I think Metternich was by far would have been a better travel companion and just an all around better person. But in terms of results, it'd be hard to beat Bismarck.
Finally, Wes, in a high tech, often highly or hyper militarized and endlessly impatient world, what's the fate of the grand tradition and keen lessons of diplomacy? Is there hope for its future?
Well, I think it is the future. I think we fooled ourselves after the Cold War into thinking that we really were in this post-historical, post-heroic world where institutions and technology were going to provide total security. So that's the last 30 years. But the prior 3,000 years shows us something very different. And I think it's the world that exists now, which is large states competing for resources and prestige and territory. And, an environment where, certainly in the United States, we don't have the ability that we had in past decades to get our way by a combination of military technology and sanctions. I think we're seeing the limits of that now. And the fact that you see so much great power diplomacy today, again, whether it succeeds or fails, is an indicator that we're reaching for this age-old tool of negotiations with rivals and also with allies. So I think it will always be part of the human condition, no matter what the state of technology. In one of his last books, Henry Kissinger, he co-authored this book with Eric Schmidt that looked at artificial intelligence. And, ever the idealist and futurist, I think, Kissinger really latched onto this idea that AI was going to revolutionize diplomacy. What's interesting is that the data that he and Eric Schmidt were looking at was the use of AI mainly in war games. And so in a war game, you can make the case for artificial intelligence optimizing outcomes in these kind of zero-sum type settings. I don't think you'll ever see an AI revolution in diplomacy of the kind that Kissinger was describing, because while it can organize vast amounts of data, and that certainly helps you with negotiations, it can analyze past agreements, aggregate a lot of information that help you inform your going in position, maybe even anticipate like coming shifts on the other side and diplomatic position of the other guy. I think the reality is that there will not come a time when sovereign states are willing to entrust to non-human forces such high-stake things of war and peace, and whether there's a nuclear confrontation or where you come out on a line of demarcation or whatever the case may be. So I think AI will be a supporting mechanism to diplomacy in some ways, but it all in the end comes down to what it's always been about, which happens within a room of people. It's not a science, it's an art. You can't quantify it. Some people are good at it, some are not. You can get better at it through study of history, through study of negotiations. And I mean, there's an art form to those things, but it's not something that can be outsourced to technology. There's an irreducible component to it that's about individual human beings using persuasion, charm, coercion, etc., to get to a different set of outcomes than otherwise would have been. And in that sense, diplomacy remains an active agent of history.
Wess Mitchell, author, statesman, and champion of exquisite diplomacy. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Tod, this was a real treat. Congrats on all the important work you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
So I've been thinking, there are an abundance of films that are made about war. We are captivated by brutal dictators and visionary leaders, resolute commanders and inspiring soldiers who wage world wars and civil wars, launch daring invasions and intrepid missions. The military dazzles and embodies the notion of courage under fire. But what about diplomacy? How many films are there about foreign ministers and secretaries of state, ambassadors and emissaries? Now, a few come to mind, like Bridge of Spies and Argo, Munich and 13 Days. And in recent years, many of us have reveled in Netflix hit series The Diplomat, featuring the fast-paced verbal jousting between husband and wife diplomats, played by Kerry Russell and Rufus Sewell, who are navigating exquisitely complex international situations. But after talking with Wess Mitchell about great power diplomacy, I became certain that diplomacy has always mattered, and it matters even more now. Now, to be sure, military might plays a major role in the relations between countries. Which nation, it is inevitably asked, has the power to overwhelm the other, and how much is that power differential? But once those questions have been answered, we wonder, is that it? Is military power all that determines the relations of nations? Nope. Where the military strength leaves off, diplomacy begins. Diplomacy strives to shrink the gaps between a weaker country and its powerful neighbor. This requires a diplomacy rich in insight and ingenuity, collaboration and compromise, knowing how to read the room and when to leave the room. It entails understanding common interests and uncommon fears, theory and practice, where you've been and where you hope to go. It advances cultures and unites nations. It defangs enemies and averts war. Many diplomatic victories are fated, even more are unknown. Fundamentally, diplomacy begins and ends with a keen apprehension of human nature. Socrates once told us that the unexamined life is not worth living, and the Oracle of Delphi advised, "Know thyself." The diplomat must understand history and culture, narrative and direction. They must capably discern the nature of their friends as well as their enemies, and most of all, they must know themselves, including their own biases and blind spots, their appetites and aspirations. As Catholics, diplomacy makes sense. This is because our faith is ordered, relational, and hopeful. We understand that every human being is dignified, fallen, and redeemable. And Catholicism tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves and to render unto God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's. Blessed are the peacemakers, says Christ, while St. Augustine reminds us that the wise man will wage just wars. To survey the history of great power diplomacy is to witness the rise and fall of humanity's hopeful intentions and earthly outcomes. In studying the history of diplomacy, may we as Catholics strive to do God's best work in the fallen kingdom of man. And one last thing. Read Wess Mitchell's Great Power Diplomacy But also read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, a tour de force of the players and the outcomes of diplomacy throughout history. From Richelieu to Bismarck, from World War to Cold War, learn from the steps and missteps of diplomats and their relevance to our world today, and how we too might make the world a better place. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Worner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.